I believe that there is this common web that is weaved into all of creation. And once we figure that out, that humans are not above the rest of that creation, I think that a lot of our social ills go away.
Welcome to Matters of Soul Importance, where we dive deeply into topics of both earthly and eternal consequence. I'm Roxane Salonen, faith columnist and features writer for the Forum, author, and speaker. For this first episode of Matters of Soul Importance, I'm excited to introduce our very first guest, Pastor Devlyn Brooks. Welcome, Devlyn, and thanks for being brave enough to go first.
Thanks for the invitation.
It's great to have you. So, to explain to listeners why I asked Devlyn to be my first guest, it goes back to December of 2021, a couple years ago, when we were invited onto Rob Port's Plain Talk podcast to discuss, is America's religious decline good or bad? I really enjoyed that conversation, and I don't know how you felt about it, but I found out later that it was one of his most listened to of that year. I think we both enjoyed it, but maybe we thought there was maybe more to say, right?
Yeah. What can you do in an hour, right? I mean, when we're talking about faith, and it's interesting to hear you talk about that in review. I might have objected to the title, looking back on it now, Religion in Decline.
You know, I was thinking, because I went back yesterday and listened to it again just to kind of refresh my memory of what we had talked about 2 years ago, and thinking about the fact that it was one of his most listened to podcasts that year. That's kind of interesting. To me, I don't know. I don't think it was us. I think it says something about the topic itself. Do you have any thoughts about that? Or?
Oh, certainly. I think faith and religion matter to most folks, whether they claim to belong to a organized religion or not. I think it speaks to some of our most instinct level about being human, right? Faith matters, and faith discussions like that just are really important to have, because despite what Pew Research or other organizations that are studying faith tell us, I think that rather than a word decline, I think faith is changing, and faith in America is changing. I think faith in first world countries is changing, and I chalk that up to the Holy Spirit. Is it in decline? I don't think so. I think, is it in a transition? Absolutely.
I have some thoughts about that, but before we go any further, I need to introduce you to our listeners. I'm so comfortable with you because we've had discussions before. We've been in contact, but Devlyn Brooks is a pastor at Faith Lutheran Church in Wolverton, Minnesota, and he also writes the Finding Faith column for Forum Communications. He's worked in journalism for 30 years, the past 16 of which have been here in Fargo at the Forum, in various roles, from the newsroom to the newspaper and digital production. Married to Shelley, the Brooks have 4 children, including one about to be married. That's super exciting, along with 2 dogs and 2 cats. You beat me on that. I only have 2 cats and a dog. So they reside in Moorhead, Minnesota, and have just 1 spud left in high school. And Devlyn also blogs at findingfaith.com. Again, welcome. And as our listeners can tell from that, you have some propensities, some loves they're similar to mine. We both write about faith for the Forum. And so we both, I guess, have found our way into the realm of not only being journalists, but also bringing something very interior into that conversation. So I think that's one of the reasons you're such a great fit for my first guest, Devlyn. But the topic we're going to tackle today is, can journalism and Jesus coexist? Now, I kind of narrowed that down a little bit to make it fun, but really, if it could be put another way, it's, can someone with a well-developed worldview or religious perspective thrive in a newsroom environment where objectivity is meant to rule? I think there's maybe a little bit of uncertainty about that, or maybe different thoughts about that. And so I want to kind of explore that with you today, Devlyn. So to lay out the base for this conversation, I just want to hear a little bit about your journeys, both your faith journey and your career journey. And maybe we'll start with your faith journey to kind of go back into your childhood. We want to hear a little bit about where God entered your life in was it infancy? Was it later? So I'm just going to let you share a little bit about that.
Light topic to start with. Huh?
Yeah, that's right.
Well-developed worldview. I think some of your readers might disagree with me, but faith. So I think I have an interesting story. So our family was very faithful. We attended church, a small church in Crookston, Minnesota, growing up. So just to give you a little bit of context, I am the youngest of 9 children. And so when I came along, the family had been in the church for quite a while. Interesting story. When I was young, my parents divorced. And what happens in a small town and in a small church when a divorce happens quite frequently is that one family kind of stays and one family kind of goes, right? And so I will be honest, from the reaction of our church at the time, because churches are made up of fallible humans, right? I was a young man that was really displeased with the response of our church to our current family situation, and I left. I left organized religion for almost all of my young life, and didn't come back until later when I had kids. I was well into my 30s, raising kids as a single father. And then I was here in Moorhead. I had already traversed Minnesota, traveling kind of the newspaper circuit, landed here in Moorhead working at the Forum. And that's when I came back to organized religion with the 2 sons going to church and getting them involved in confirmation. And so my journey back is interesting. I feel like there was this tug all along from God. But I ran away from it for quite some time, and then ended up getting married about 11 years ago and started becoming a lot more serious about my faith, getting involved at our church, serving on the church council, serving in confirmation and in teaching and going on mission trips with youth. And at some point, our pastor walked up to me one night on a Wednesday night event. We were in kind of the Christus Rex, where there is a bunch of youth, and it's a big, open space. There was some kind of youth, and Pastor Matt Vallon came up and put an arm around my shoulder and said, "You are a future pastor." And I laughed it off. A few years later, I found myself in seminary. And so that was 2016, worked my way through seminary while I was here at the Forum still. And I started serving at Faith Lutheran Church in 2017. So I was kind of a working lay preacher at the same time that I was going through seminary.
So before we go too much further into that, I'm going to go way back and ask, how old were you when your parents divorced and this critical moment happened where you began to question God? I'm just kind of curious, like, where your brain was at, brain development wise, and at what point things became kind of muddy for you.
Yeah, so my parents divorced when I was 4, and so it was early. And my mom, bless her heart, she had a lot of kids at home and a lot of responsibility, and she was a single mom, and she worked very hard as a small-town waitress, and so we met at the church when we could. She did our best to get us there, and then probably 10, 11 years old, I finally decided that I'd had enough, and I walked away from it.
And that kind of makes sense, because 12 years old is kind of when the brain becomes a little bit more complex, starts thinking about things a little bit more deeply. And so that does make sense that way. I'm wondering too, as you were sharing about your faith journey, did you sense God's presence? Like, was he still there somehow tapping you a little bit along the way, or did you just kind of put him in the background and on a shelf, or did he come in and out? How did that work? Or all of a sudden did he emerge all those years later and say, "Hey, I'm still here"?
Yeah, I think with many things, the benefit of hindsight is I would have answered to you differently during that period, right? But looking back now, especially after my journey towards ordination, I can look back and I can tell you exactly where the Holy Spirit was guiding me. Putting up those bumpers on the bowling alley lane, so to speak. And I do remember that there was an episode in my early 20s when we were a young family and struggling. There was a pastor in International Falls that had intervened and was really helpful in our family life at the time. And I remember there was a pull and a tug saying, I could do that. But then we had a second child, and bills take precedence, and I ended up moving again on the journalism train. Back in the 90s, it was not that unheard of that newspaper people moved, right? I mean, it was just part of the job, and you hopped to bigger places and bigger places. And so life intervened, and it kind of got put. You don't go back to get your master's when you're young and broke and have two young kids, and so. But
I think you make an important point in that sometimes we don't always see that journey, or we don't see God's hand in our life until later on. And it's only in hindsight that we're able to look back and sort of make sense of it and put the pieces together. And I think that's really important, because there are times where in our life where God feels and seems very silent. And so that isn't necessarily an indication that he's not there. And so it's just interesting to look back in hindsight. I think that's often where we can discern where God was at in our life, or whether he was in our life. So you kind of touched on your journalism career, and I do want to talk about that as well, to hear what started that. Like, was there a love from an early age of communications, or did it happen in college, or what sparked that?
Yeah, so it was college. I had previously been a pretty voracious reader, in high school. I will be honest, in high school, I really didn't have an understanding that you could get paid to write. Right. I just enjoyed reading. Becoming a novelist seemed way out of my reach. Right. But I went off to college, and just happened, we'll use air quotes, right? One of my best friends that freshman year knew from the get-go that he was going into mass communications. So we ended up on the same floor at the dorm room, and true story, sophomore year, he was taking an intro to writing class, and he looked at me and he said, "Hey, you're good at writing. Come take this class with me." Impressionable sophomore, right? I didn't have a major declared, so I went with him, and it was kind of like a 100 level intro to media class where, you get a kind of brushing of everything: newspapers, magazines, radio, TV, a lot different than the way journalism is taught today, right? And it bit me. The class, the studying of journalism, the authors that I ran across, and I dare say I ran into Mike Royko, a columnist, of Chicago fame, and Mike Royko's writing kind of changed my life. That's who I was going to become.
Interesting. And it's also interesting from a parenting perspective, which we're both parents as well of young adults. And just kind of watching our kids find their way. Something seems so random sometimes, like that invitation that your friend reached out to you, and there you were, and all of a sudden your pathway was before you. It's just so interesting, I think, how our lives move along a track, and how different people come in and out of our lives to shape who we become. And of course, God being one of those forces, but he works through people, right? He works through others to touch our lives, and then we make choices within that. So it's really interesting. I want to kind of come back after a break here and talk more about the merging of these two things. And I know early on in my career, I was somehow pointed out that that the newsroom breeds cynics, that there wasn't a lot of faith people in the newsroom. And I don't know if that's true or not. We're going to talk about that and whether those two things, if Jesus and journalism and a worldview that is well-formed and this business of communications can coexist, and we need to be objective. Is that a good thing? Is it a bad thing? I want to hear from you after this break, Devlyn, so we'll be back in a little bit.
When you can't make it to City Hall or school board meetings, local journalists from Inforum.com will be there to report the facts and get your questions answered. Local news works for you. Stay up to date at Inforum.com.
You're listening to Matters of Soul Importance. I'm Roxane Solonen, and I've been having an interesting conversation today with Pastor Devlyn Brooks. I call him not Pastor, but Devlyn, because that's how we know each other, and he said that's okay. So we're talking about whether journalism and Jesus can coexist. That's the main topic. But again, another way to frame that would be, I'm not, not just Christianity. We happen to have a Christian worldview, but anyone who has a strong, well-formed worldview, can they be a good journalist? Can they be truly objective? We haven't even really gotten into that because we've just been kind of talking about the background of you going through your faith life, some different things that propelled you in one direction or the other, and then also your career and how that kind of took off and became a love of yours. But I am curious now to go into the meat of things. Was it hard when you began to merge these two worlds? I mean, they were merged because you were in the journalism sphere, in the communication sphere, as you were having this transformation, as your faith was coming back to you in a more real way. You'd gone through something significant. And I think that's another important thing to mention. I think some people maybe who look from the outside in at people of faith might think we have it all together. But really it's in the woundedness, and it's in the difficulties that we find our need for God, and we tend to notice him. So that's something that, you went through a hard time with the divorce. And I don't know if you want to speak to a little bit to that, of how that kind of was a pivotal point for God to rush into your soul a little bit more.
Yeah, standing on the doorstep of 50 years old, it's a little easier to look back, right? And, I would describe it as looking back and knowing that it was absolutely the darkest times in my life that kind of shaped and formed the man that I am now, right? And so it's easy for me to look back and see how it is that so again, in Christianity, we believe in Jesus' salvific, efforts, and I can see where Jesus stepped in to fill those cracks for me, right? And I wouldn't be the person or the pastor I am without the heartbreak that I suffered, and I think that that's one of the things that helps me become more relatable in my writing about faith. I think it helps me become more relatable in my relationships with people I serve in my congregation too, because I will be the first one to admit that those who profess faith fall apart at the same rate as those who don't. I will be the first one to admit that there was no rosy path to this point where I'm at now. It was a lot of struggle. It was a lot of dystopian disconnection with what I felt like was a cruel universe. And I grew up as a kid way faster than any kid should have to. But I cherish that now because it was those breaks, it was those crevices that allow me now, 40 some years later, to allow that light to shine through me. And I hope in my faith and in my faith writing, I hope that's what people see.
Did you ever, as you were getting closer to this moment of deciding those little seeds that were planted about you maybe being a pastor, not only coming back to your faith, but actually leading people into faith and consoling people and being that spiritual father. At any point, did that seem like Was there a point where that seemed to rub up against in a negative way with your career as a journalist? Was there any hesitation there in merging those two things?
It wasn't for me, because internally I see how they mash, right? It's interesting. When I first went back to seminary, actually no one here at the Forum knew. I started attending, and for the entire first year and a half, I was going to seminary, and I hadn't explained this to anyone here at the Forum. I was less concerned about how people felt about me being a person of faith in the newsroom than I was about employment. Full transparency. You get a little concerned about the company executives hearing that you're going off, and all of a sudden that you're diving deep into this faith thing. And I thought, well, I got a mortgage to pay, so.
Right.
And then in 2017, about a year and a half after I had started, I got this offer from our synod. So in our denomination, the synod's kind of the regional organizational structure, and our bishop came to me and said, there's this little rural church south of here that could use some leadership. This would go well with you going to seminary. Essentially you'd be a lay pastor gaining the experience right along the theological experience in seminary, right? And I said, yeah, this is a calling. I can't pass that up. And then there was this little click in my brain that decided, I don't think you can be a pastor somewhere and on the web and not tell work.
There we go. Yeah.
Yeah. And so the funny thing is I can remember not too far from where we're sitting now at the Forum headquarters here, but in another room on this same floor, I had this existential moment where I was going to tell my supervisor that, hey, here's this thing. Right. I'm going to seminary, and you may see me leading a church now, but it doesn't mean I'm giving up on this job. Right. And my supervisor, there was 2 heartbeats, and she looked at me and she says, "You're totally a pastor." And that was it. This year and a half of angst and anxiety that I had lived with about, somebody here at Forum Communications figuring out that I was going to seminary. And within 2 heartbeats, the whole secret was out. And in a typical newsroom, it was about 3 minutes later that all other 40 people on the floor knew. And there was just kind of this nonstop train all day long of people stopping by my office and congratulating me and telling me that it was so cool that I was doing that and pursuing it. And so this thing that I fretted over for so long opened into this just God moment, and it was wonderful.
You were out of the church closet.
I was out of the church closet.
And there you are. And everyone was accepting of that. So do you think there is any, even though for you that wasn't an issue, have you sensed that at all in journalism, that there is kind of a, as far as the objectivity goes, and maybe some people's ideas that you can't have this strong faith life and also be objective?
Yeah, I think it is. I think it's an ongoing discussion, and it's a worthy discussion, right? I mean, I know that there are academics every year that spill barrels of ink on this entire issue, and there's probably this spectrum of how people place on this. This is what I can tell you in my personal experience. We're human. I look at being a person of faith and a journalist much akin to somebody that's writing about science, right? Here's the thing. There's plenty of science that is, you have to place your faith in it, right? Do we think the sun's going to rise tomorrow? Absolutely, right? Is there a % of a chance that it won't? Sure, there is. And so I think if you're covering science, you have to accept the fact that there are certain unknowns, right? I think that's how I lean into this career of being an unabashed faith person that is also a journalist and writes about faith. Here's the thing. I can't convince you personally that there is a God. I can't convince you that there is a God who created this universe, right? What I can do is, through my faith writing, is show you my perspective of that and how I see the world and how it's playing out. And so I think it absolutely coexists. Interestingly, way before I ever went to seminary, and this is probably another one of those seeds that you had talked about. When I was firmly in the newsroom, when I was an editor here at the Forum, and I supervised a group of 6 writers, there was a New York Times journalist who wrote about religion. And so remember, this is before I was really even back in the church, or that I ever knew that I was going to go to seminary. And I was reading an interview with her one time, and she said when the New York Times editors came and asked her to take this role to write about religion. And for those that don't know, writing about religion for the New York Times, that's a big proposition. It's one of their featured writers, right? And she said in her deliberations about taking the job, she came to the conclusion that if she was going to write about religion, she had to accept that God was real. And to accept that she understood God to be real. Because otherwise she wouldn't be writing about it faithfully or in full transparency. And she went back with that caveat to the New York Times editors, and they said, that's fine. We understand. And so I make no pretenses about who I am. I don't pretend to be a journalist that is objective. I am writing a faith column based on what I understand to be a God that created this universe. I think as long as we are open and transparent about that and faithfully respect that readers that might read us are not, I think we can create a relationship there.
Talking about a little bit about my own trajectory here, in this very place too, not too far from, just a few steps from where we are now. I was hired full time after being a columnist as a features writer in 2011, towards the end of 2011, I think. And one of the things that happened is, as I interviewed people, if we went in that direction of the soul kind of thing, I noticed that it got really deep, and I would let them go there. And that kind of became something that I brought into things without really trying. But I just noticed that the people that I was interviewing seemed to come alive, and I felt like that was encouraged. At some point, I think that became something that unknowingly I wasn't trying to do that. It happened, and I saw the spark in people when I allowed them to go there. So I love that I get to do that. And whether it's a column that I write or listening to people and hearing their stories, it's such a gift to be able to go into the interior of someone and hear like really how they tick and give them the freedom to go there. So a question I have for you, do you think that now that your faith is out there and flourishing more and you're a leader in a church, do you think that has allowed you to be a better journalist, or has it inhibited you? I mean, I think I know the answer, but I want to hear how things have maybe changed and maybe gotten better now that you're able to be all that you are and not have to hide any of yourself.
I think it's made me better in the sense of I'm comfortable with who I am. I tell people this a lot. And so when I go out into let's just say the faith sphere, right? Whether it's at my church or synod events or other places where I volunteer in a pastoral role, right? And because of the fact that I write for the Forum, there's probably some more regional notoriety that I wouldn't have as a pastor, but I feel like I have this privilege and this platform of being able to write about my faith. And so I think it's made me better simply because of the fact that I've become more comfortable in who I am as a pastor. And I don't mean that to sound arrogant or elitist, but what I'm saying is that I step into every realm with Pastor Devlyn, and I no longer make a difference between Devlyn the journalist or Devlyn the dad or Devlyn we won't go husband because that one would get me in trouble. But I say to people, there was a turning point in my own mind where I realized that as soon as I opened the door to the Forum in the morning, I'm still stepping across that threshold as Pastor Devlyn. And it's my responsibility to wear that title in a human and in a gentle and in a compassionate way, and not this way that is threatening or, demeaning or elitist. And I think that's really important. And I think that's how it's made me better.
It sounds like the two enhance each other, that they both got better as those two parts of your lives kind of merged into each other. Before we go today, I want to ask you, Devlyn, from your heart, what is it that motivates you, especially as a pastor? What is it that you wish people knew? I know that's what you try to do through your column, which is at findingfaithin.com, right? That's your blog. We got that wrong the first time. So findingfaithin.com. What is your main, they say that every writer has a main point, one main point that you say over and over in different ways. What is your heart?
Yeah, I think it's really important. Words matter, right? We all know that. We all know that the things that we say, the things that we read, the things that we write are very influential. And so it was by design that I write under the title of Finding Faith. And so why do I say that? Because I truly believe each person has faith. I try very hard to steer away from the big R word. Religion is off-putting for many, and probably deservedly so, right? I mean, there's been as much bad done in the name of religion as there's been good done. And so I really, really fight hard to use the word faith. And I have found that even as a pastor, if you enter into a relationship asking about a person's faith, that leaves so much more room for them to determine and share with me what that means to them. I think that if you come at them with the big R word and all of the dogma and doctrines that follow religion, it's off-putting. And so I seek to know another person's faith, and I allow that. I think there's broad parameters for them to be able to then come back with and explain that to me and share that with me. And I've found even those that don't have a lot of faith in churches that have four walls and, the institutions that are run by the powerful, right? But if you ask them about their faith, I think everybody internally knows that they have faith. It may not be the same God I worship. It may not be the same denomination that I'm in, but somewhere there is a base level of faith in all of humanity. I know how I see that and perceive that and how I see the world playing out. You may see that a bit differently, but I think there is a web that we're all connected to, and I think that's why we got to keep having these conversations about faith.
One more question. If you could put it in one word, what faith is to you, what would that word be?
Communion. And not in the sense of Eucharist, but communion in the sense that we are all attached to one creation. And I know that in our Western world, we have kind of disassociated ourselves as human and placed ourselves above the rest of creation. But I think that one person at a time, that we have to make efforts to restore that communion, because regardless of who your faith deity is, I believe that there is this common web that is weaved into all of creation. And once we figure that out, that humans are not above the rest of that creation, I think that a lot of our social ills go away.
So, can Jesus and journalism coexist? It's a question that's been debated in the field of journalism, but not just journalism. You may remember a few years back when Senator Dianne Feinstein was grilling Supreme Court Justice Amy Coney Barrett at her confirmation hearing. Feinstein contended, "The dogma lives loudly within you, and that's a concern." Judges do need to be impartial, and so do journalists in our work. But does that mean we cannot have a well-developed soul? That was the question I asked Pastor Devlyn Brooks, a fellow journalist and Lutheran minister. His answer, yes, of course. In this day of social media, it's nearly impossible to find a journalist without some kind of expressed worldview. Our personal lives are no longer as hidden as they once were. Even Devlyn knew there was a timeline in how long he could keep quiet about his moonlighting as a seminary student. It was going to come out eventually, and thankfully, it worked out well for him. To add a few thoughts of my own, I would contend that having a vibrant faith life should increase the likelihood of a person being able to be a more humane listener and therefore a better journalist. I'm sure some would still argue the point about journalism and faith working as a team. What do you think? Can Jesus and journalism coexist? Visit my website, roxanesolonen.com, and let me know your thoughts through the contact form at the top of the homepage. You can also Google Peace Garden Passage. In our next episode, we'll hear from the mothers-in-law of 2 Fargo police officers who were involved in a tragic shooting right here in Fargo this past July, an incident that ended the life of one of their comrades. Where was God on July 14th? We'll find out soon. Until then, don't lose sight of the light.